So before we really get into the meat and potatoes of this, just for our audience, like why are these semiconductors like so important? Like they're just computer chips, right? Just can't everyone make those, have those?
Well, they are just computer chips, but today we rely on computer chips for everything that requires computing, which in these days refers to almost all devices. Anything that has an on-off switch, with the exception of light bulbs, has a computer chip inside of it. And that it's not only your smartphone, it's your computer, but it's also microwaves and dishwashers and automobiles, which will have dozens, if not hundreds, of chips inside. So access to chips is crucial, and producing the most advanced chips is extraordinarily difficult and expensive, such that only a small number of companies dominate their production. And when you look at the most advanced chips, there's really just a handful of companies that have almost monopolistic positions in the industry. So they're ever more important in our daily lives, crucial for the economy, but also controlled by a limited number of companies in a small number of countries.
So there's no such thing as like a mom and pop semiconductor manufacturer making them the way they did 100 years ago.
Not so. There's the first chips were actually only invented around 60 years ago, and although there are still a large number of relatively low-tech chips in production for simpler solutions, the most advanced chips today have billions of features, each of which is smaller than a coronavirus. And so the manufacturing of these chips is one of the most complicated processes that humans have ever undertaken. And it's also one of the most expensive as a result.
Well, you just compared semiconductors to coronaviruses. I think we've been demonetized, and this episode will be shut down by YouTube.
So Chris, you mentioned that they're expensive to make. Like, what are we talking about in terms of the cost to build a semiconductor factory for the most advanced kind?
If you're looking at the most advanced chips, a new facility could cost $20 billion, making them arguably the most expensive factories in human history.
Wow, like only a handful of billionaires could possibly afford that.
Only a handful of companies, only a handful of countries can afford it as well, which is why you've had extraordinary concentration in the industry and a lot of power accruing to the firms that are able to do it.
What countries are we talking about?
When you look at processor chips, the types of chips that run the operating systems in your phone or your computer, Taiwan produces many of the processor chips we rely on, and most of the most advanced chips. Around 90% of the most advanced processor chips are made by Taiwan's TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. If you look at memory chips, there's a lot of concentration in Korea, where Samsung and SK Hynix produce around half of all the world's memory chips.
But not America?
Well, the U.S. invented computer chips, and there's a lot of U.S. firms that play a really critical role in their production, whether the software you use to design chips, the machine tools you use to produce them. But U.S. firms have fallen behind in the actual manufacture of chips. So today, it's basically impossible to produce an advanced chip without using U.S. technology, but most of the production of advanced chips actually takes place in Taiwan, South Korea, or elsewhere offshore.
Because I remember, like 10, 15 years ago, Apple switched to using Intel chips. And those are American, right?
Yeah, Intel's a U.S. company, and Intel produces most of its chips in the U.S. or in Europe, although they've just started outsourcing some of their most advanced chips to Taiwan, where TSMC now produces Intel's most advanced chips. Apple actually abandoned Intel chips and now is designing its own chips.
In like 2020, they changed it, right?
That's right, pretty recently. And now Apple's chips are all, at least all of their key processor chips are all produced by TSMC in Taiwan as well.
Is that a good idea?
Well, it depends who you ask. It's a good idea for Taiwan because they've made an extraordinary business out of producing chips, and TSMC is one of the world's most valuable companies as a result. And Taiwan itself, around a third of Taiwan's exports are computer chips, so it's crucially important for Taiwan's economy. But for the rest of the world, this concentration does introduce risk that I think people are just beginning to realize how reliant we are on one country and one company in Taiwan for our most advanced processors.
With Taiwan having such a valuable chip factory, it almost makes me want to take over Taiwan.
Well, I hope you don't do that, because any sort of attack on Taiwan would prove hugely disruptive for the global tech ecosystem and the economy. And I think if you want to put it into context, think of the semiconductor shortage the past 2 years, where we've had hundreds of billions of dollars in delays to auto production and all sorts of other manufacturing. In 2020 and 2021, chip production globally increased both years. There was a larger number of chips produced each year. It's just that demand grew even faster than supply. Whereas today, Taiwan produces around 1/3 of the new processor chips we use each year. And so if that were to get knocked offline, we'd face horrific delays, not only to smartphones and PCs, which would be almost impossible to procure, but also autos and aviation and microwaves and dishwashers. It's almost incomprehensible how large the cost would be.
Are you saying I might have to like talk to my family or go for a walk outside?
It's not just that though. Anything that turns on and off today usually requires a chip. So your dishwasher, you couldn't buy a new dishwasher. Microwaves would face horrible delays. Modern life would really grind to a halt.
We'd have to churn butter by hand the way that we used to do in the 90s.
I've churned butter once or twice. Rest in peace, Coolio, who inspired Weird Al's version.
Oh, I was like, what the?
That was your hey, so you mentioned Taiwan and South Korea, but I know China eagerly wants to build up its own semiconductor industry. Where does that stand? How did it start? How advanced is it?
China's been building semiconductors now for over half a century, but its industry until recently was really a second-tier player. There was a fair amount of assembly of chips in China, which is a low-value part of the process that comes at the end of the semiconductor production process. But about a decade ago, Chinese leaders began to realize that China had a fair amount of vulnerability given all the chips it was importing. And today, China spends more money importing chips than it spends importing oil. And because of this, Chinese leaders have launched a campaign to try to reduce chip imports by building up China's own industry. And this has made pretty substantial strides by some metrics over the past decade, although China is still very reliant on foreign suppliers for a lot of key semiconductor technology.
Now, you said building semiconductors is incredibly expensive. China probably has the money for it, thanks to all the foreign investments. But is this a problem that they can just throw money at and they'll have all the semiconductors they need, or is there more to it?
Well, it's interesting on the question of the amount of money that you need. On the one hand, China's spending in aggregate probably in the low hundreds of billions of dollars over this decade in its semiconductor industry. It's hard to know an exact figure because spending is happening at the local level, the national level, the provincial level. But the number is large. But because it's not focused in one specific direction, actually for any individual firm, the amount of funds isn't necessarily that large. And so there are issues with Chinese firms that can't raise the capital they need. And $20 billion is a lot of capital to raise if you wanted to build an advanced semiconductor production facility. But in addition to that, you need software and you need tools from abroad to manufacture advanced semiconductors. And today, most of those software and tools either come from the US or are subject to US export controls. And so the US is restricting the ability of China to access these tools, and therefore it's impossible to build advanced chips in China today.
I mean, can you walk us through briefly like the steps it takes for like to get a semiconductor chip in a phone? Because like there's like all these different pieces that are happening in different parts of the world just so I can have like an iPhone with a semiconductor in it, or several probably, because it's got, a bunch of different chips in it. But like, can you walk us through like one type of chip?
Yeah, so if you take an iPhone, it'll have, depending on which model you've got, a dozen or so different chips inside. The main processor chip in an iPhone is designed by Apple. There's a team of chip designers that Apple has hired in Silicon Valley, in Israel, in Germany, and elsewhere that design the chip. And designing chips is a really complicated process. The chip in a new iPhone will have 10 billion transistors on it, tiny electrical switches that turn on and off. And you've got to put each transistor in the right place to get the chip to work optimally. And so you need to access some pretty specific software to do that. And there are 3 companies that make this software. They're all based in the United States. Once you've designed the chip, you need to produce it. And producing chips of this nature is done in Taiwan by TSMC, but TSMC itself needs to acquire materials and machines from other companies to do it. In terms of materials, you need ultra pure silicon on which the chip is actually made, plus a bunch of really pure and complicated gases and chemicals, largely from Japan. And then you need machine tools that are able to etch and deposit materials just a couple of atoms thick. And these tools are bought predominantly from the United States, from Japan, or from the Netherlands. And so there's a multinational supply chain that you need to access in order to build these chips. And then once they're fabricated in Taiwan, they're finally sent usually to China and now somewhat to India for putting in an iPhone. And so the iPhone relies on these chips. They're assembled in China, but really they're made in Taiwan using tools from Japan, the US, and the Netherlands.
So this sounds like a very globalized process.
I think I wouldn't say it's globalized. I'd say it's internationalized, but it's not global because a small number of countries control it. And most countries don't have access to the technology and are at the whim of those that do. And actually mapping out who's got control over what tells you a lot about which countries are able to exert power through their control of chip technology.